This marks one of Iron Man's most desperate moments. He lies weakly on the spaceship, slowly activating his battle-worn helmet, intending to record the final moments of his life. Because in Avengers: Infinity War, Thor's strike failed to hit Thanos' vital spot. Thanos used the last of his strength to snap his fingers, wiping out half of all life in the universe, turning them into dust. On Titan, only Nebula and Tony survived. To return to Earth, Tony spent day after day modifying the ship, but despite his efforts, the ship was still stranded thousands of light years away from Earth. At this point, the ship was out of supplies, and the oxygen could only last until the next morning. Nebula and Tony were trapped in despair, lying in the ship, waiting for death. Just as they were about to suffocate, a sudden burst of light outside the ship awakened Tony. In that moment, he saw hope. The visitor was none other than Captain Marvel, the Cosmic Guardian. She used all her strength to pull the entire spaceship back to the Avengers headquarters on Earth. When Tony saw Steve, his first words were,
"Lost the kid."
Peter's death weighed heavily on Tony, filling him with guilt. Fortunately, Pepper was still alive, able to stay with Tony. Due to this unprepared battle, a physically weakened Tony became extremely irritable. He had previously told everyone that he wanted to use alien technology to arm the whole world, but he had not received any support. Now, Tony no longer trusted Steve. Tony became more agitated as he spoke, even removing the nanotech reactor from his chest and handing it to Steve before collapsing from exhaustion. Thor also blamed himself for not landing the fatal blow on Thanos with his axe. Losing his former arrogance, seeing the extent of Thanos' oppression on Earth, Carol was determined to kill Thanos, reclaim the Infinity Gauntlet, and restore the half of life that had been lost. But at that moment, no one knew the full extent of Captain Marvel's power.
How do we know it's gonna end any differently than it did before?
Because before you didn't have me.
Hey, new girl. Everybody in this room is about that superhero life.
Thor also summoned Stormbreaker in front of Carol. Nebula analyzed their readings and found a spike in the energy from the Infinity Stones. They discovered that a planet similar to Earth had recently erupted with an energy signature matching that of the Infinity Stones. They speculated that Thanos must be there. However, they were unaware that Thanos had already begun his retirement life at this point. He seemed to have just been through another battle, dragging his exhausted body back along a small road. He was about to rest when a powerful energy blast descended from the sky. Captain Marvel seized the opportunity, locking Thanos' arm. Bruce, in his anti-Hulk armor, and War Machine also restrained Thanos, and then Thor used his axe to sever Thanos' left arm. But when Rocket flipped the Infinity Gauntlet over, they were shocked to find that the 6 stones were gone. It turned out that in order to prevent humanity from using the Infinity Stones to alter reality, Thanos had used the properties of the stones to destroy all of them. This act nearly cost him his life. Everyone assumed Thanos was lying, except for Nebula, who knew that although her adoptive father was evil, he never lied. Seeing all hope shattered, Thor grabbed Stormbreaker and delivered a fatal blow to Thanos. Thus, the once mighty tyrant fell. At that moment, the others fell into sorrow, knowing that without the Infinity Stones, those lost might never return. Unknowingly, 5 years passed. In an underground parking garage, a rat accidentally stepped on the quantum tunnel button. As the machine slowly powered up, an unidentified object shot out from the quantum realm. It was none other than Ant-Man, Scott Lang. At the end of Ant-Man and the Wasp, Scott had entered the quantum realm to collect quantum energy to cure Ava. As a result, outside, Dr. Pym and his daughter were turned to dust by Thanos' snap, and Scott was trapped in the quantum realm. After Scott emerged from the quantum realm, he tried contacting his teammates, but received no response. Confused, he walked down the street, unaware of what had happened. The once bustling streets were now empty. Noticing missing persons flyers on utility poles, Scott began to realize something was terribly wrong. He couldn't believe that while he was trapped in the quantum realm for just 5 hours, 5 years had passed in the real world. Frantically, he searched the gravestones for his daughter Cassie's name, only to find his own name among them. In a panic, he rushed home. Fortunately, his daughter was still alive and had grown into a young woman. Scott then made his way to the Avengers headquarters. Steve and Natasha were both astonished to see Ant-Man Scott still alive. Scott explained his experience, telling them that due to the time differences in the quantum realm, the 5 years that passed for them had only been 5 hours for him. He boldly suggested that they could use the time difference in the quantum realm to build a time machine, travel back to the past, and retrieve the 6 Infinity Stones to undo the destruction caused by Thanos' snap. To test if this idea was feasible, they sought out the now-retired Tony. However, no matter how hard they tried to convince him, Tony refused, claiming it was a fantasy. Now with a daughter of his own, Tony only wanted to live a quiet life, far removed from violence and conflict. Seeing that Tony wouldn't budge, Steve turned to another brilliant mind for help. At this point, Bruce had successfully merged the Hulk's strength with his own intellect. Although the two no longer clashed, Marvel fans knew that Hulk was much weaker in this new form. To save the lives that had disappeared, Bruce decided to give it a try. Since the quantum realm wasn't Bruce's area of expertise, Scott was used as a test subject. In a matter of seconds, Scott experienced the entire cycle of life, birth, aging, and death. After barely recovering, Scott felt frustrated, wondering why he had become the experiment. That night, Tony looked at a picture of Peter and fell into deep thought. In his basement, he decided to run simulations of Ant-Man's idea. To his surprise, the time machine could actually be built. However, after seeing his daughter, Tony began to worry that he might lose the life he currently had. Ultimately, with the understanding and support of Pepper and his daughter, Tony decided to return to the Avengers and join forces with Bruce and the others to complete the seemingly impossible time travel mission. Tony also retrieved Steve's shield, and the two reconciled at that moment. With everything in place, they just needed Hawkeye and Thor. Thor, once the beloved muscular hero, had now become a 300-pound super recluse. Though Thor had decapitated Thanos with Stormbreaker 5 years ago, he was still trapped by the trauma caused by Thanos, leading him to spend his days binge drinking and playing games in Asgard, far removed from his former heroic self. The others could hardly believe that the mighty Thor had fallen so far. With Bruce and Rocket's encouragement, Thor returned to the Avengers headquarters, but even though he was physically there, he was still clutching a beer in hand. Meanwhile, Natasha ventured to Tokyo to find Hawkeye, who had become a wandering Ronin. Because of Thanos, Hawkeye is the only one left in his family. For the past 5 years, Hawkeye has been venting his emotions by massacring gangs. Seeing that Hawkeye was consumed by hatred, Natasha told him that there was now a chance to bring everyone back. In that moment, a broken Hawkeye saw a glimmer of hope. The group began assembling the time machine day after day. As they neared completion, Colonel Rhodey raised a question: why not simply travel back in time to when Thanos was still in diapers? Bruce explained that, first, such an action would be too cruel, and second, altering the past would create a new timeline. This meant that changing the past might not necessarily change the future. The most important task now was to find all the Infinity Stones and return to the present timeline, then use the power of the Infinity Stones to resurrect the deceased. Afterward, they could return the stones to their original places in time, since each time travel required Pym particles, which were invented by the young Dr. Pym, and there were only enough for each person to make a round trip once. This meant they could not afford to make any mistakes. The time machine was successfully built, and Hawkeye was the first to test it. He traveled back to the moment before Thanos snapped his fingers. Upon hearing his daughter's voice, Hawkeye broke into a long-awaited smile. Clearly, they had succeeded. After some discussion, the team decided to split into 4 smaller groups, each going to different time points to retrieve the stones. Tony, Steve, Bruce, and Scott would travel to the point of the Battle of New York. There, they would retrieve the Tesseract, the Mind Stone and Loki's scepter, and the Eye of Agamotto from the Ancient One. Thor and Rocket would travel to Asgard to recover the ether, which was inside Jane Foster's body. War Machine and Nebula would head to Morag, where Star-Lord would soon take the orb, the Power Stone. Finally, Natasha and Hawkeye would go to Vormir to retrieve the Soul Stone. In the 5 years they had lost family and friends, today they finally had the chance to get everything back. The team, fully geared and determined, set off to gather the 6 Infinity Stones. As the time machine activated, the team was successfully transported to the various points in time where the Infinity Stones were located. Bruce was the first to find the Ancient One and asked her about Doctor Strange's whereabouts. The Ancient One explained that Bruce had arrived 5 years too early and that at this point, Stephen had not yet become Doctor Strange. Bruce noticed the time stone around the Ancient One's neck and asked to borrow it. The Ancient One refused and explained why it couldn't be given away. Knowing how urgent the situation was, Bruce was about to forcefully take it when, in an instant, the Ancient One casually slapped Bruce's soul out of his body. Bruce was stunned by the sheer power of the sorceress. He then decided to use his soul form to explain the situation to her. Despite his continuous explanations, the Ancient One was still skeptical. She insisted that if she handed over the Time Stone, the world would be shrouded in darkness. and as the Supreme Sorcerer, she could never allow the Time Stone to fall into anyone else's hands.
Remove one of the stones, and that close splits. Now this may benefit your reality. My new one, not so much. In this new branch reality, without our chief weapon against the forces of darkness, our world would be overrun. Millions will suffer. But tell me, Doctor, can your science prevent all that?
No, we can erase it. Because once we're done with the stones, we can return each one to its own timeline at the moment it was taken. So, chronologically, in that reality.
Yes, but you're leaving out the most important part. In order to return the stones, you have to survive.
We will. I promise.
I can't risk this reality on a promise. It's the duty of the Sorcerer Supreme to protect the Time Stone.
And why the hell did Strange give it away?
However, when Bruce mentioned that Steven would eventually give the Time Stone to Thanos in the future, the Ancient One's attitude suddenly shifted. Bruce was full of confusion. With a subtle movement of the Ancient One's hands, Bruce's soul was restored to his body. Then, the Ancient One cast a spell, retrieving the Time Stone from the Eye of Agamotto and handed it to Bruce. She explained that Steven would one day become one of their most powerful sorcerers. His actions must have a reason behind them. Perhaps all of this was destined to happen. Thus, Bruce successfully obtained the Time Stone. Meanwhile, Steve's team had split into smaller groups to continue their missions. Tony quietly flew into Stark Tower, where Loki had already been captured by the Avengers. Looking at Steve, Tony couldn't help but praise him, having carefully chosen his moment. Scott, with Tony's help, successfully possessed the past Tony. After completing his task, Tony gracefully turned and jumped down, as the original Avengers prepared to take the elevator to the first floor. The angry, original Hulk tried to join them, but was immediately rejected by the others. After scanning by Tony, the Scepter of Mind was being taken by Hydra agents. Steve, upon learning their location, calmly entered the elevator. Everyone expected him to engage in another elevator fight like before, since he had famously been the elevator battle champion. However, this time, Steve defused the situation with just one sentence.
Hail Hydra.
The funny thing is, they really believed Steve was a Hydra member, but things were not that simple. As Steve made his way through the building, he encountered his past self, the past Steve. Thinking the future Steve was Loki in disguise, immediately attacked. The two Steves fought their way from the upper floors to the lower ones. Eventually, the past Steve noticed a pocket watch Peggy's falling from the future Steve's body, causing him to momentarily hesitate.
Bucky is alive!
Finally, the future Steve used the Scepter of Mind to subdue his past self. While Steve managed to obtain the Mind Stone, things were not going as smoothly for Tony. He had arrived on the first floor and was getting into position for the disguise. Scott seized the opportunity to sneak into past Tony's reactor and launched a surprise attack. With Scott's help, Tony was able to retrieve the box containing the Space Stone. Just as Tony was about to slip away down the stairs, he was unexpectedly knocked away by the original Hulk, sending the Space Stone tumbling toward Loki's feet. Loki, seeing an opportunity, quickly snatched the Space Stone and vanished. The trio was now in despair. They had only one Pym particle left for a return trip. Tony then had an idea. They could both retrieve the Space Stone and replenish their Pym particles by traveling to 1970 in New Jersey, where S.H.I.E.L.D's experimental base was located. This was where Dr. Pym had developed the Pym particles, and the Tesseract was also stored there. So, Steve asked Scott to take the Mind Stone back to their current time, while he and Tony would use the last Pym particle to travel back to 1970. If they failed, they would be trapped in 1970 forever. Disguised, Steve and Tony infiltrated the base. Tony managed to cut through the security and successfully acquired the Tesseract. However, just as he placed it in his briefcase, he heard a familiar voice behind him. It was Howard Stark, Tony's father. Tony was caught off guard, but luckily, Howard didn't recognize him. They had a heartfelt conversation, even discussing raising children. In that brief exchange, Tony realized his father wasn't as harsh as he had once thought. Howard loved his child deeply. It was Tony. Meanwhile, Steve managed to pull off a trick to divert Dr. Pym's attention while he took the Pym particles used for time travel. However, when he looked up, he unexpectedly ran into Peggy, his first love. In order to save half the lives lost, Steve suppressed his emotions and left the scene, but in his heart, he had made a bold decision. Meanwhile, Thor and Rocket traveled to 2013 Asgard. Thor was mainly focused on drinking and wanted to go to Odin's wine cellar to grab a drink. Rocket was furious, but eventually persuaded Thor that their mission was more important. However, when Thor spotted his mother passing by, he couldn't control his emotions, since today was the day his mother was killed. He pretended to follow Rocket but disappeared in the blink of an eye. Thor followed his mother, but she soon noticed him, despite Thor trying to disguise himself. His mother, raised by witches, immediately saw through him and recognized him as from the future. Thor desperately wanted to warn her about what was about to happen, but his mother stopped him. Meanwhile, Rocket successfully obtained the ether from another part of Asgard. With the mission nearly complete, Thor embraced his mother for one last time, but just as he was about to leave, Thor suddenly remembered something. He reached out into the air, and with a burst of wind, Thor finally summoned his beloved Mjolnir back into his hands. Meanwhile, Nebula and Rhodey arrived on the planet Morag in 2014. Seeing Star-Lord's foolish antics, Rhodey couldn't hold back and punched him, knocking him out cold. They successfully stole Star-Lord's key and opened the vault door. Nebula, using her super alloy arm, carefully reached through the barrier and retrieved the orb containing the Power Stone. They planned to return to the Avengers base, but at that moment, Nebula began to malfunction. It turned out that Nebula from this timeline had formed a bond with Nebula from the future, and their memories began to merge. Thanos sensed what was happening in the future and the Avengers' time travel plan.
He knows.
In response, Thanos set a trap. He first captured the future Nebula and then made this version of Nebula disguise herself as the future one to infiltrate the Avengers. This time, Thanos planned to erase all life in the universe, ensuring that no one would be left to oppose him. With the final Power Stone in hand, the team returned through the quantum tunnel to their original timeline. However, Hawkeye informed everyone of a cruel piece of news. Natasha had bravely sacrificed herself for the Soul Stone. She had thrown herself off a cliff to trade her life for the gem. Everyone was devastated, with Bruce especially enraged. But with things as they were, the most important task was to use the 6 Infinity Stones to revive half of the universe's life. Tony remotely controlled the 6 Infinity Stones, slowly embedding them into the glove he had crafted. With the Infinity Gauntlet now ready, the real question was who would snap their fingers with it. And that became a problem. Thor volunteered, but was quickly stopped by the others. Seeing the arguments escalating, Bruce stepped forward, stating that the glove primarily emitted gamma radiation, and no one else was more suited for the task than him. The Avengers agreed unanimously, and they immediately took defensive positions. As the Infinity Gauntlet was placed onto Bruce's hand, a powerful surge of gamma energy exploded outward, causing Bruce to painfully collapse to his knees. Thor quickly urged him to take off the glove. Once Bruce recovered, he summoned all his strength to snap his fingers, just like Thanos had. In that instant, Bruce's arm was visibly shriveled by the immense power, but Tony was quick to provide first aid. Then, they saw the sudden appearance of a bird and the call from Hawkeye's wife, signaling that those who had disappeared were returning. However, before they could rejoice, Bruce's eyes widened in shock. A massive warship began firing relentlessly at them, launching dozens of missiles. Within seconds, the Avengers' headquarters was reduced to rubble. They hadn't expected that this was all part of the fake Nebula's plan. She had secretly used the time machine to open the quantum tunnel, bringing Thanos from the past into this timeline. Now trapped beneath the debris, the team struggled to move, with Bruce using his immense strength to hold up the rubble. The Ant-Man, who could freely adjust his size, successfully escaped. Hawkeye, agile as ever, was unscathed and even retrieved the Infinity Gauntlet. But this was exactly what Thanos wanted. He sent a group of Chitauri soldiers to chase after Hawkeye. In order to protect the Infinity Gauntlet, Hawkeye gave his all, constantly swinging his weapon. Hawkeye was about to take a short rest when Nebula approached. Seeing the reinforcements arrive, Hawkeye handed the Infinity Gauntlet to Nebula. Just then, Gamora and the true Nebula arrived to help. It turned out that the real Nebula had told Gamora everything about the future, including how they had reconciled on Ego's planet and become close sisters. Gamora chose to trust the future Nebula. Now, Nebula tried to convince her past self, but the past Nebula was stubborn and unyielding. The only choice left for Nebula was to kill her past self with her own hands. At the same time, Tony woke Steve from his coma, and together they slowly moved toward the exit, only to find that Thanos had been waiting for them all along. It was as if everything had come full circle, back to a few years ago. They wouldn't let this tragedy repeat itself. As Thanos donned his helmet and armed himself, the battle was clearly about to erupt. At that moment, Thor unleashed a lightning strike that hit Tony. The energy siphoning device on Tony's back absorbed the strike and redirected it at Thanos, unleashing a wave of lightning. Seeing this, Thor threw Mjolnir, but Thanos used Tony as a shield, and the massive impact sent Tony into unconsciousness. They couldn't believe that Thanos had already figured out their plan. He arrogantly declared his intention to destroy the entire universe and then rebuild it anew. The three of them would not let the tragedy unfold again. Thor, too reliant on his weapons, was pinned to the ground by Thanos and beaten. Despite his severe injuries, Thor recalled his Stormbreaker and tried to fight back, but Thanos seized the opportunity and countered. Just as Stormbreaker was about to pierce Thor's chest, Mjolnir suddenly flew up from a distance and struck Thanos, sending him flying. Mjolnir then flew into Steve's hands, empowered by the might of Mjolnir. Steve's abilities were greatly enhanced, and he charged at Thanos, forcing him to retreat after just 2 rounds. Thanos couldn't believe that Steve was able to wield the power of thunder as well. Although Steve used all his strength, Thanos was only slightly injured, but when Steve missed an attack, a furious Thanos quickly turned the tide of the battle. Thanos swung his weapon and launched a merciless attack on Steve. Steve was wounded in his leg, and his Mjolnir was knocked from his hands. Steve couldn't believe that even his vibranium shield was shattered by Thanos' mighty weapon. However, Thanos didn't deliver a fatal blow. Instead, he made them watch as he destroyed the planet. A blinding light shot down from the sky, and thousands of Chitauri soldiers descended onto the battlefield. Even in such overwhelming odds, Steve, still battered, showed no fear. He gripped his shield tightly, prepared to fight to the last breath. But just then, a voice echoed in Steve's earpiece. It was Falcon's voice. Behind Steve, golden portals began to appear, and through them, the Avengers who had perished in the snap began to emerge. Doctor Strange, the Guardians of the Galaxy, Peter, the entire Wakandan army, and Valkyrie's Asgardian forces all arrived. Joining the fight, Ant-Man and Hulk also emerged from the rubble. Even Pepper showed up, wearing the armor Tony had made for her. Now, all the superheroes from the Marvel Cinematic Universe were united on the battlefield. The three of them were no longer fighting alone. The most epic and emotional final battle of the Marvel Universe had begun. At Steve's command, the Avengers charged forward with a unified roar. In response, Thanos arrogantly gestured, and all the Chitauri soldiers surged forward like a swarm of locusts. With Cull Obsidian leading the charge, the unprecedented battle had officially begun. The enlarged Ant-Man single-handedly took down a flying whale with a single punch. Each hero fought with everything they had, slaughtering Thanos' army. Though Thanos' army appeared fierce, it was largely a disorganized mass. Thor, seeing Steve wielding his Stormbreaker so impressively, grew a little frustrated and decided to trade Mjolnir for it. However, Tony was ambushed from behind by Cull Obsidian. Just as Tony was on the brink of death, Peter appeared in time, using his webs to pull Cull Obsidian away, and Ant-Man seized the opportunity to stomp on Cull Obsidian. Thanos had lost another important soldier. Peter wanted to explain everything to Tony, but after 5 years apart, all Tony wanted to do was give him a hug. However, the reunion scene between Star-Lord and Gamora took a sudden shift in tone. The Gamora before him was from the past, and she didn't recognize him at all. Thanos' goal was still to get the Infinity Stones, and the only hope left for the Avengers was to send the stones back to the original timeline via the quantum tunnel in the van. However, it would take another 10 minutes to start it. At that moment, Hawkeye was doing everything he could to protect the Infinity Gauntlet. Though he was agile, he was still just a mortal. In the nick of time, Black Panther, clad in his vibranium armor, descended from the sky. He grabbed the gauntlet and began a high-speed relay race, with his armor shielding him. Thanos' monstrous creatures couldn't touch Black Panther. Just as Black Panther was nearing the finish line, Thanos attempted to stop him, but suddenly a woman in red appeared. Wanda, consumed by the desire for revenge against the one who killed Vision, wasted no time unleashing her full power. Her chaos magic shattered even Thanos' indestructible weapon. Then, Thanos was lifted into the air, and his armor was gradually torn away. He gritted his teeth in pain. Unable to endure further, Thanos ordered his forces to fire indiscriminately from his ship, even if it meant hitting him as well. To eliminate this red-clad woman, the bombs rained down like a storm, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. The sorcerers quickly raised their magic shields to block most of the damage. However, Thanos' decision to launch the assault caused the dam to be breached by the bombs. If things continued this way, the entire Avengers army would be drowned in the flood. Doctor Strange immediately used magic to block the torrent. Black Panther dashed forward to recover the falling Infinity Gauntlet but was frozen by Ebony Maw's mind control. Fortunately, at that moment, Peter leaped over, took the Infinity Gauntlet, and immediately activated his one-hit kill mode. However, with so many of Thanos' creatures surrounding him, even Peter with his 8 arms couldn't fight them all off. To keep the relay going, Steve threw Mjolnir with all his might, and Peter, seizing the opportunity, shot out his web and narrowly escaped the encirclement. With Pepper's help, Peter safely mounted Valkyrie's flying horse. Even so, Thanos' ship kept bombarding the battlefield, and Peter was struck by a missile, crashing to the ground. His tentacles were completely destroyed in the explosion. As the relentless bombardment continued, the Avengers were on the brink of disaster, their lives hanging by a thread. But they looked up, noticing that Thanos' ship was inexplicably aiming at the clouds. Tony's AI analyzed that something was piercing through the atmosphere. Suddenly, a golden light pierced through the clouds, completely ignoring all damage and tearing through Thanos' ship. The arrival of Captain Marvel sent the Avengers' morale soaring. All the female heroes from the MCU gathered around Peter to protect him. At this moment, the Marvel Universe officially entered the Avengers era, but unfortunately, Natasha could never come back to life. Meanwhile, Ant-Man successfully activated the quantum tunnel. With the Infinity Gauntlet in hand, Captain Marvel charged toward the finish line like an unstoppable armor-piercing projectile. As Captain Marvel approached, Thanos, frantic with rage, used his broken battle blade to destroy the quantum tunnel. Their last hope was shattered. The only hope left was to prevent Thanos from obtaining the Infinity Gauntlet. Seeing the dire situation, Tony rushed forward to try and grab it. Steve and Thor stepped forward to help. But even with all 3 of them working together, they were no match for Thanos. Just as Thanos was about to put on the Infinity Gauntlet again, Captain Marvel took advantage of the moment, unleashing a series of powerful punches, but her blows had no effect, and Thanos easily tossed her aside. It seemed as though tragedy was about to repeat itself, but Captain Marvel got back up, rushing once more and gripping the gauntlet. In the face of such a formidable opponent, Thanos was filled with fear. Suddenly, Thanos activated the Power Stone, delivering a punch that sent Captain Marvel flying. At that moment, Doctor Strange realized this was the only chance they had. He extended a finger and signaled to Tony. Tony instantly understood. He was the 1 in 1,000 chance. In the instant Thanos snapped his fingers, the wounded Tony grabbed the gauntlet, but Thanos easily flung him away. Thanos thought he could finally snap his fingers, but after doing so, nothing happened. He turned around, only to realize that all 6 Infinity Stones had transferred to Tony's hand. Tony used his last bit of strength to snap his fingers. Thanos and his entire army turned to ash. Rhodey rushed to Tony's side, and as he looked at his old friend, now near death, everyone around them was overcome with grief. The once carefree playboy had ultimately given his life to protect the Earth. Later, they held a grand funeral for Tony. The man who saved the Earth countless times will forever remain in our hearts. And with that, the entire film series came to an end.